Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 3 of my PlayStation Vita retrospective. Today we're covering the third year, that's 2014, and we're going to go through all the notable physical releases. I'm going to do digital separately this time because this list is pretty long. This may be the biggest year for the Vita, with 42 physical releases and quite a few digital titles as well. Things are going to start slowing down. Sony isn't really putting as much effort in anymore, but there's still some big titles this year, some really interesting stuff. The niche stuff really picks up this year. 2 new console launches, which we'll get to. Stuff that we didn't even think was going to come out over here because it had been in Japan for a year. And it did kind of come out here with a bit of, not really a whole lot of fanfare, but some great stuff. So let's just get right to it. And we're going to start off this year with one of my favorite titles ever. Really notable for its original Vita release. It's been released twice on the PS4 now, but it's just such a cool game and it has a real niche following now that people have been able to play it. That is the original Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. If you don't know much about this game, Danganronpa is an adventure game made by Spike Chunsoft, really in that kind of Ace Attorney mold. The story revolves around characters trapped in the Hope's Peak Academy, and there's no way out, and an evil bear named Monokuma is trying to trick them into killing each other and then holding trials to see if they can figure out who the murderer is each time. It's a really interesting premise. There's a whole bunch of crazy anime stuff in there that is over the top, and you wouldn't think it has like a really great, interesting story, but it does. All that anime craziness kind of comes together in a really interesting way. There's amazing characters, there's some great plot reveals, really good stuff here. I really recommend it. It's a bunch of fun. Definitely if you're into games like Ace Attorney, and if you're not into any kind of visual novel stuff or any kind of adventure games, this is one to totally try. You got to get past the anime aesthetic. I know a lot of people aren't really into that, but really in this game, even though it looks so over the top, it's actually a pretty good one for that. It doesn't quite cross the line into the typical anime tropes that would drive a lot of people crazy. So check it out if it sounds like something that would interest you. Next up is Touken, The Age of Demons. With this game, the Dynasty Warriors developers try to bring a Monster Hunter-like series to the Vita. This takes place in a Japanese-themed medieval-era fantasy world where warriors band together to hunt Oni after a huge demon breaks free into the world. In the game, you create a character and take on missions to defeat smaller hordes and bosses to collect items and get improved weapons and gear. The game has a 5-chapter single-player campaign and a 4-player multiplayer mode. It was exclusive to the Vita, but an updated version called Touken Kiwami came out later on the PS3 and 4. Following that, the next game I have really just for my Final Fantasy collection, and that is Final Fantasy X. Now you'll notice I said 10 and not 10 and 10-2 as the collection states because actually only 10 is on the cart. Final Fantasy X-2 is a download code, so technically there is no physical version of that. There's not much to say about this. It's kind of based on the same remaster that already came out for PS3 and 4, so it's just a handheld way to play it. And I guess it's on Switch now too, so lots of ways to play this. Next up, another quick mention for a port of a PS3-4 game. That is Deception 4 Blood Ties. Now, this was better on PS3 and 4, but it's just neat that this niche series where you set up traps to take out enemies got a physical portable release. Now if you're into this game, you probably want the PS4 version over those other two, not just because it's the latest version, but also because it includes the kind of second game expansion in there. So twice as much content if you grab that there. Then we get to Dynasty Warriors 8 Extreme Legends Complete Edition. Now, this is the most complete version of the game, possibly of the best Dynasty Warriors game right now, and this version was a Vita exclusive for about 4 years until the Switch version came out pretty recently. With how 9 went, I think 8 is considered the best one in the series, and so if you're into Dynasty Warriors, this would have been a cool place to have it at the time. Right after that, MLB 14 The Show, obviously, an exclusive baseball series for Sony, so I just gotta mention that, Vita got this version as well, which is cool to have portably if you're into that. Right after that, an update to a game we talked about last episode, Ragnarok Odyssey Ace. This update to the original game is also available on the PS3, and it includes all the DLC from the first game and a ton of new content and updated gameplay balance. The new content includes additional enemies, skills, dungeons, and a new extra chapter that takes place after the original game. Which brings us to Conception 2 Children of the Seven Stars. This was available on the Vita and 3DS. It's a dungeon crawling RPG with turn-based battles that was developed by Spike Chunsoft, so I kind of wrote this game off, but I think I might need to check it out after doing this research. It's a follow-up to a PSP game that was never released in North America, although the story and characters are completely new, so you don't have to know anything about that original release. The game takes place in a high school that trains demon hunters, and it has Persona-like social mechanics where you form bonds with your classmates that allow you to create different star children, which are fighters, like kind of little creatures you use in battles. The battle system has a focus on placing your fighters around enemies to take out their weak points, and apparently it even has some DLC where you can fight Monokuma from Danganronpa, so definitely what piqued my interest. If the writing and characters are anything like Danganronpa, it's probably great. I'm surprised I ignored it for so long. It's just there's so many games like this that I can never tell which are good and which are worth playing. Which brings us to the next game, Demon Gaze, which is an anime-style first-person dungeon crawling game where you create your own characters and explore wizardry-style dungeons while fighting the demons within. This is a follow-up to a game called Students of the Round, a Japanese-only game that takes place in the same world but thousands of years before this one. The game has the player controlling the character Oz and creating a party to help him explore the game's 8 dungeons. The character creator has 7 different classes and 5 races, and in the dungeon you'll face 10 major demons that once you beat them, that you can summon them and they give you unique abilities. One unique aspect of the game is that you have to earn enough money to kind of afford to stay at the inn. So every time you come back from a dungeon, you stay at an inn where you can do the social aspect stuff and form bonds with your other characters. And that brings us to the first hardware release for the year. That is the Borderlands 2 PlayStation Vita bundle. Now, this is something that I think came out with almost no advertising. I didn't know about this till much later, and I ignored it because, I already have a Vita, why do I need this? But then I found out this is bundled with the PlayStation Vita Slim, which is just a much nicer model of the Vita. It's smaller, it's got a different screen, it's just, a little bit better. The Japanese version had come out last year, and so I could care less about the Borderlands 2 on here. I mean, that's a great game, but I'm not going to play it portably. I think this was only a download code in here anyway. But yeah, great version of the Vita if you can find it. The original is great too. I mean, it's not like as big a change as the PSPs or the 3DS upgrades, but just a cool thing to know about since they didn't really push it. Which brings us to the next release I have, which is one I picked up just last week actually. I found it pretty cheap used. I've always been interested in it. That is Mind Zero. This is another Japanese RPG that's inspired by Persona and Wizardry, so that's a running theme this year, those two influences. This was a game created by the developers of Class of Heroes, which were 2 good niche first-person dungeon crawlers for the PSP. And like those, it is another first-person dungeon crawler with turn-based battles. In this one, the characters use their mind manifestations, which are kind of personas, and their abilities to explore a spiritual world full of monsters. The game takes place in Tokyo and stars high school student Kei, who learns that he has mind powers and teams up with 5 other characters to try and figure out what's going on with the monsters attacking the city, the spiritual world, and their mind powers that they've gotten. Apparently the game ends on a cliffhanger with a bunch of unanswered questions, and there's no sequel in sight, so that might be a reason to avoid it, just as a long RPG that might not give you the payoff you're looking for. Right after that is the Sly Collection. Yeah, just worth mentioning, another port of a PS3 collection, and like a lot of ports, this one only has Sly 1 and 2 on the cart, so Sly 3 was a download only, and I think that code's expired now, so you can't even use that if you get it new. But yeah, interesting for Sly fans. And right after that, a really interesting release, well, mostly for weebs, that is Hyperdimension Neptunia Producing Perfection. This is, I think, the first Idolmaster style game that we've gotten in English on consoles. The game has you acting as a producer, working with the CPUs from the Hyperdimension Neptunia universe to promote them and build up their popularity. This is all after the idol group Mod 48 appears and starts winning over their fans. So if you haven't played the original Neptunia games, their popularity kind of determines their power, and so it's a big thing for this group to come in and steal their fans. In the game, you got the 4 main characters in a series of concerts trying to put on the best performances throughout this story mode. You start off with just one character, but eventually you kind of get them all working together and lead them as kind of a group. The CPU candidate sisters also appear as characters in the story, but you can't really put them in your idol group. This is a really interesting game if you want to check out what those Idol Master games are like. They're so popular in Japan. And, you know, this was a neat kind of thing, especially if you're into Neptunia. Following that, another collection, the God of War collection, which just includes God of War 1 and 2 for Vita. You know, those are great games, so just another place to play those. Then a visual novel, X-Blaze Code Embryo. What I didn't know about this was it's actually a visual novel set in the BlazBlue universe, which makes a lot of sense as the story mode in those games are basically long visual novel segments broken up by fights. The story has very little to do with what happens in those games though. It's a prequel to the main series. It takes place 150 years before it. It stars a new cast of characters which aren't in the BlazBlue games, so really just for fans of BlazBlue lore who want to see kind of what happened before that world became what it was. This was also released on the PS3, but in my opinion, it's always better to play visual novels on a portable system. Then another PS3 update, Akiba's Trip, Undead and Undressed. The first Akiba game we got over here, the second game in the series. It's an action game set in Akihabara where you attack vampires, ripping off their clothes to make them burn up in the sunlight. Yeah, very crazy anime style kind of game that was originally released on the PS3 and later got a PS4 release, so it may not be the best way to play it now, but just interesting that it came out. Then we get Disgaea 4, A Promise Revisited. So this is a port of the original PS3 game with all the DLC, plus a new level, scenario, characters, and a ton of other minor additions. So great for Disgaea fans. I think actually a more complete edition is coming out on the Switch this year, so maybe going to be a bit out of date, but still really cool for, you know, those last 5 years if you wanted to play more Disgaea 4. So the Hyperdimension Neptunia train for Vita has started rolling. We're going to get a lot of these games. And the next one we get is Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 1. This is a complete remake of the first Hyperdimension Neptunia game, and it shares a lot of elements with the third game in the series, Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory. Or is that Mega Dimension at that point? I can't keep track of those. This game still follows the story of the original, but the gameplay, script, and endings have changed quite a bit. Because of how the original game played, it's a big update that's worth checking out. You know, the other two games we're going to talk about later, they aren't quite as different as their original ones, but this is totally different, so worth checking out. Unfortunately, there was some debate about if this changed ending made it canon, and it's still not quite. So yeah, this game still isn't canon with the rest of the games, but honestly, it doesn't really matter because the Neptunia series is such a multiverse of just all these different universes and, you know, games that don't connect to each other that it's not that big of a deal. This was a really cool introduction to the characters. It's actually a story I enjoyed, I think, quite a bit more than the later games just because of how it was told. But yeah, if you're into Hyper Neptunia, you've probably already played it. If not, it may not be the best one to start with. Which brings us to Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair. I did not think they could top Danganronpa 1. That was a high bar to set, honestly. And the ending of that game leaves in a place that I'm not quite sure. There's lots of places they could go, but I didn't really know if they could bring back the same kind of feelings they did with the first game, and they nailed it. The characters are great. The story twists and turns are as good as the first game, maybe better. The way they mess with you because of, you know, what you know from the first game and how they change it up in this one, really interesting stuff. And yeah, just like the first game, it's almost the exact same format. You play a group of characters who are trapped on an island this time and are forced to participate in these murder games and trials to try and figure out who's behind it all and, you know, what's going on. There's a couple new mechanics, like a virtual pet simulator that you can play with. There's a bonus game at the end, just like the first game, that's kind of a strategy sim thing, a really simple thing that's just fun to play and see more about the characters interacting in a way that's not, you know, the stressful ways they deal with in the main game. If you've only played Danganronpa 1, definitely worth checking out. If you haven't played Danganronpa 1, definitely play that first and then come check it out, because yeah, just a great kind of adventure game visual novel. Highly recommended. And just another PS3 port worth mentioning, Arcana Heart 3 Love Max. So a portable version of the second iteration of the third game in the all-female 2D anime fighter that was released on PS3. And then Natural Doctrine. This is a fantasy-themed tactics RPG by the director of Patapon and the character designer of Fate Zero. That doesn't really show, but it still seems interesting, even though the visual style is a bit lackluster. The gameplay tries to do something new with the genre, pitting your party made up of 10 defined characters against an overwhelming number of enemies. The battle system is pretty complicated, and there's a big emphasis on placement because your characters can act together if they are positioned correctly, and you lose the match if even a single party member dies. So definitely more of a focus on keeping your characters alive than, even something like Fire Emblem. The game is considered extremely difficult by some. I've heard it called the Dark Souls of SRPGs with how often you die and how much time you're set back. I read they released an easy mode patch at some point, so that might be worth checking out if you found it too difficult and never tried to go back. Then worth mentioning, there was also an online mode that used cards and had deck building mechanics. I'm not quite sure how that measures up to the main game, but yeah, it looked pretty crazy from the trailer. Which brings us to our last hardware release for the Vita, the PlayStation TV. This thing is super cool, and they could not give it away at launch. It was about $100 or maybe $130 for this bundle that came with the PS3 controller, and it dropped down to, I thought, at $50. This is Canadian, so it's probably cheaper in the States, obviously. But yeah, it dropped to $50. I thought it dropped to $20 at some point, and they just disappeared. And now I've heard they're pretty expensive and hard to find. I haven't looked up the cost. This thing had everything going against it at first. It didn't play all Vita games that required the touchpad, like Uncharted, which I think a lot of people would want to play. Didn't work on it because there was no touchpad. But it's still super cool to use a controller and play on your TV for the games that it could play. A lot of people hack them now, which is kind of recommended based on how often these memory cards fail and how easy it is to get content for it. I hate to promote that stuff. Yeah, but with how the memory card situation went on the Vitas, I kind of have to recommend it just because you can use a typical SD card or USB stick to get way more data and not have to worry about it failing as frequently. Not a big deal now, but the thing also supported some PSP games that you could get off the PSN store. And I think PS1 titles that you get off the PS1 store, like you could on PlayStation 3 and PSP. I'll have to check that for sure. I'll cut this out if I'm wrong. And that brings us to another over-the-top Japanese anime game, which I think you can start to see where the Vita is going. That is Senran Kagura Shinobi Versus. This is the second main game in the series, and I think the first game to come out in English. I also think this only came out in a special edition box, which is pretty expensive and hard to get now. I had that originally and sold it a while back. But as the series grew, I wanted it back, and I managed to find this game-only version for pretty cheap, so I was happy about that. If you don't know about this series, it's a niche Japanese ninja school girl beat-em-up. It's kind of like Dynasty Warriors combat, but in much smaller missions. Maybe something like Onjinbara is comparable. The game has a huge emphasis on anime-style ecchi graphics, and it's just all about lewdness. It features 4 different ninja schools, each with 5 playable characters and its own campaign mode that's made up of visual novel style story segments and 25 missions each. You earn money throughout the game that can be spent at the in-game shop to purchase different costumes and accessories for the girls. They are as revealing as you would expect from this kind of game. Overall, it's a decent beat 'em up, bit repetitive, but a decent fighting system. It's made for a very specific audience, as you can imagine. I'm sure just looking at this, you'll know if it's something that's for you or not. And after that, Freedom Wars, which is a game I wrote off completely because of the generic cover art, and never considered it to be something that's right up my alley, but now I need to find myself a copy because this thing looks really cool. This was developed by Sony Studio Japan. The game is basically a futuristic take on the studio's previous God Eater series. It's kind of a sci-fi Monster Hunter style game that features missions that can be played alone or 8-player co-op. There's also competitive modes. The story takes place in a future where humans have to live in cities underground, and any criminal has to fight off monsters called abductors to reduce their sentence. It's a very Monster Hunter style game, but it just looks so different and cool because it's futuristic and there's a lot of shooting and fast-paced action. Definitely something that might have, scratched that Phantasy Star itch. It looks like a fairly developed game that had a decent budget, but it's a Monster Hunter game too, right? So it's all about taking down monsters and getting better equipment and deep, complex systems around that. Still, it looks fun and worth checking out. There are 6 groups of weapons that include different melee and gun options. You also have a thorn accessory, which is a wire tool that can be used for traversal or to pull enemies, and changing it can give your character various bonuses and abilities. And you also have an Android AI that supports you throughout missions. So I'm going to try and get this and check it out. I hope it's not a slog single player. I've heard it's not that bad, as you know, a typical Monster Hunter game would be that way, but I'll see. And that brings us to the last game I have in my collection. That is Tales of Hearts R. This is a remake of the DS game Tales of Hearts that came out in 2008 in Japan only. So it's the first and only Tales game for the Vita, and like most other Tales games, it has no connection to the previous games. The game has the playable character Core, who meets a girl who's been attacked and infected by a monster. While he tries to help her, he ends up shattering her heart and goes on a journey to collect the pieces and fix it. Like the previous Tale games, it uses this kind of real-time battle system. Star Ocean is similar. It's a system where you go into an environment where you can move around freely, attack freely, and use different abilities. And this is the latest iteration of that. The original DS game had a 2D battle system, kind of like the older versions of the series, but this remake now uses a 3D environment for battles. The original 3-person battle party from the DS game also now has a 4th slot for guest characters, and this latest version of the battle system features a new chase mechanic where you can pursue enemies that get launched into the air to get more hits in. So I guess they added some air juggling to the combat. And the last game for the year is another version of a game that came out for PS3, but one that is better on the Vita just because that's what it was designed for. That is Hatsume Miku Project Diva F2nd. So the first game was only digitally on Vita, so this is the only game I think that came out physically on Vita in the series. It has over 40 songs, including some from the previous games and 2 completely new ones that haven't been in any of the games in the Project Diva series, even though we didn't get all of those games here. The gameplay is mostly the same, but there's some changes, including touchscreen and double scratch notes. There's been various improvements to the character models, the character room mode, and the AR mode from the last game, so enough new stuff to check out here. And that's it for 2014. Well, for the physical games anyway, I'll do a video at some point for the digital stuff that's worth checking out. I'm going to try and get through 2015 soon at some point. I think 2016? Is 2016 up? I'm not sure if I've done 16 yet, but I've definitely done 17 and 18. So I'm hoping to get through all of the Vita stuff soon. Lots of other retrospectives coming up. I've been off for a little bit, but I got a lot of stuff I got to get through now. So subscribe and, hit the bell to stay notified because YouTube has been brutal for that recently. It really helps motivate me and get me to go through this stuff more quicker. So I appreciate that. Thanks for checking out this video. Check out my other retrospectives if you haven't. I have a ton up for all kinds of different systems. So learn about some new games. I'll see you guys later.